Alechem, everyone. That's hello in Yiddish. And today I have the great pleasure of interviewing someone that I've been watching in his 15-minute Yiddish lessons through the National Yiddish Theater Folkspina. Let me introduce Muttel Didner. Hi, Muttel.
Hi, Sheila. So good to be with you, and
Hi,
thanks to everybody for joining us today.
yes, it's great. And when I say Shalom Alechem, you say
Alechem Sholem.
Alechem Shalom. So Yiddish was a part of my history growing up in the Bronx and Queens in New York City. And it was a big part of Muddle's life, but he didn't really come to it until a little bit later into his later childhood years and into college and then after that. So Muddle, you are now the Associate Artistic Director of the National Yiddish Theater Folkspieler. That's the wonderful theater that put on the Yiddish Fiddler on the Roof that everyone in our community, we had a special bus trip down there and I saw it twice. It was fantastic. And, but I want you to start with telling us how you got involved in Yiddishkeit and Yiddish, because growing up as a kid in New York City, as you did, or New York area, as you did, you were Jewish, you had your bar mitzvah, but you weren't steeped in Yiddish. Tell us about your journey.
Sure. So I grew up mostly in the 1980s, and my grandparents all spoke Yiddish, but my parents, who also grew up, by the way, in the Bronx and Queens, did not grow up speaking Yiddish. It was the secret language that my grandparents would speak to each other when they didn't want the children to understand, which is a very common story in America. For them, growing up in the 1950s, assimilation was the name of the game. And so by the time I was born, the world of Jewish education had changed very much. So whereas my father grew up, the Hebrew school that he went to, they taught him the prayers using the Ashkenazi pronunciations of the Hebrew. I was taught with modern Hebrew pronunciations, which are closer to Sephardic. So it was a little bit strange that we would learn to say words like emet, and our parents and grandparents, when they were called up to read at our bar mitzvahs, would say words like emes, and so there was a real disconnect there. And our education was really all about ancient, of course, biblical Jewish history, up until around the destruction of the Second Temple. And then apparently nothing very interesting happened until the Holocaust, and we learned a lot about the Holocaust, and then, of course, about the modern state of Israel. But they left out about 2,000 years of our history and culture and what happened during that time. But we had a sense from our families what Jewish culture was. Certainly in the foods that we ate were Ashkenazi foods for the holidays, and we heard klezmer music, and we we knew the personalities, the Borscht Belt comics and things like that. And my grandparents lived on the east side of Manhattan when I was a child, and so we used to spend a lot of time with them. They lived in an area in New York City called Stuyvesant Town, which is in the East Teens, so not quite the Lower East Side, but a little bit above that. But it was close to Second Avenue, where we would have lunch almost every Sunday at the Second Avenue Deli, and we would sit in the Molly Pecan room surrounded by Yiddish theater posters. And my grandmother and grandfather would tell me about the Yiddish theaters that used to be in the neighborhood. And when I was a teenager, my love for theater was really starting to emerge. And my grandmother took me to see an off-Broadway show called The Golden Land, which was bilingual, half English, half Yiddish, and it was the story of Jewish immigration. Well, I didn't know it back then, but the creator of that show, Zalman Mlotek, and his cousin Moshe Rosenfeld were a big part of the Yiddish cultural scene, and Zalman would go on to become the artistic director of the Folkspina, and and I would be working alongside him as an adult. So these were some formative experiences. Also, when I was a teenager, I was getting into folk music, and my grandmother gave me a record of Theodore Bickel sings Jewish folk songs. So that was another kind of formative experience with Yiddish. When I was in college at NYU studying theater, I came across some Yiddish plays in English translation that were fascinating, and I could tell that these were, very important stories that captured a very important time in Jewish history. And the translations weren't so great. They weren't really performable. So as a budding director, I really couldn't see producing them as such. But there was there was a desire to get to the root of the languages, to get to the to learn the Yiddish, but there really weren't a lot of opportunities back then. This was the 1990s, and there really weren't as many Yiddish classes available. But serendipitously, in the early 2000s, Yiddish really started to take off. And I was walking down the street in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, and I happened to see a flyer on a lamppost for what was called an instant Yiddish class. So it was a 1-hour free class at a local synagogue, and I had the time of my life, and I took the bait and I signed up for more classes. And turned out it was the Workers' Circle, at that time known as the Workmen's Circle, but now known as the Workers' Circle. And I'm actually a 4th-generation member, but as far as I knew, it was just a burial society, because all I knew about the Workers' Circle was that my grandparents and great-grandparents were buried in Workers' Circle cemeteries. So when I found out that it was an active organization and that there was still a professional Yiddish theater in operation in New York City, I jumped at the chance. So as I was learning Yiddish, I was also volunteering with the Folkspiele for several months until a staff position opened up, and then about 4 or 5 months after I began volunteering, I came on board with a professional staff, and that was 19 years ago, and I've been with the company ever since.
So that's great, Madhu. I want to put you in the context though of the life times of my great grandparents, grandparents, and yours. So you're another generation from me. But I want you to talk about what happened. So in the 1880s into the 1920s, we had millions of our Ashkenazi relatives, grandparents come from Eastern Europe and settle in America. Many of them had children who, like my parents' generation, did not speak Yiddish, wanted to become Americanized, did the Hebrew school, did the Americanized Jewish thing as you've talked about it. But Yiddish was somewhat on the way out. We had Israel, where Yiddish was not encouraged as much as Hebrew was. That was the language of Israel. And so by the time you got into the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Yiddish was a language that many thought was disappearing. But it rose up again in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And your generation is kind of bringing it back. I want you to talk about, I know you worked for a while at the Yiddish Book Center that Aaron Lansky from New Bedford, Massachusetts did, and he is more in your age group than mine. How did the revival happen? Why do you think it happened? Why was Aaron able to go to homes all around the world and get Yiddish books from people who said, I'm so glad you're taking them, Aaron, and saving them, because my children and my grandchildren can't read them and don't want them. And now we have a renaissance of Yiddish. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think it sort of happened in stages. It really began in the late 1960s, when ethnic pride really came to the forefront. So at the time that universities started to have Asian American studies and African American studies, Jewish studies became part of the educational landscape, and there were Yiddish classes. I believe the first ones that were offered were at Columbia University, and there was also the Columbia hosted the summer course from the YIVO, which is the Institute for Jewish Research, and a lot of those first pioneers were children of Holocaust survivors were who wanted to learn Yiddish as not just the language of the home, not just a language to schmooze in, as we say, but really as a serious language of with a world literature. Um, the klezmer revival followed that in the 70s and into the 80s. With a rediscovery of the musical roots and Yiddish folk song as well, and then I would say it was in the 90s into the 2000s that the theater started to attract younger performers who may not have spoken Yiddish fluently, but learned Yiddish. They would learn their lines sometimes by rote as necessary, and that just sort of flowered. So we've really seen in the last 20 years that I've been involved with Yiddish theater, we've brought in well over 100 young actors, many of whom never had any contact with Yiddish other than knowing that their grandparents or great grandparents spoke the language. Many of whom aren't Jewish and had no contact with Yiddish at all, and had a really great ear, were willing to put in the time and effort to learn, and there really was this renaissance. As far as the Yiddish Book Center goes, I was a translation fellow there. They have a wonderful program where they train Yiddishists to translate Yiddish books into other languages, primarily English, of course, and I think that writers are going to be the next big wave of young people contributing to the Renaissance. That's the one area that we haven't had quite yet. We haven't had new material being written in Yiddish, but we're starting to see that happen with new people writing poetry and song lyrics, some prose. And I think we're going to see a wave of new Yiddish theater contributions over this next rising generation of millennials and Gen Z.
We will get to talking about the Renaissance in the theater. And I know we can talk about the 1920s era, which was a great era for Yiddish theater. But before we do that, let's go back to the basics. And I know in your wonderful series of 15-minute lessons in Yiddish, the first one you had was all about the history of Yiddish. We're going to play a clip from that later. But first, so many people that I talk to say, oh, it sounds just like German. Isn't it just the dialect of German? Well, no, it isn't. So Muddle, give us a short summary of the travels of the language that we now call Yiddish.
Sure. So Yiddish is a layer cake language that really contains the history of the Ashkenazic Jewish people. We start with ancient Hebrew, which of course was the language of the Torah. At the time of the Babylonian exile, when much of the population of ancient Israel was physically brought to Babylon, which is present-day Iraq, that population started speaking Aramaic as their daily language. It's a related language to Hebrew, but it's a separate language, and they mixed in some Hebrew with it because there were certain terms, especially religious terms, that there was no Aramaic equivalent. So they're speaking this mixed language of Aramaic and Hebrew. Even when they went when the exile ended about 60 years later, there were 2 generations or 3 generations born that were speaking Aramaic. So they kept Aramaic. They didn't go back to speaking Hebrew. Hebrew was the language of prayer. Fast forward to the time of the Roman occupation, there were 2 uprisings of the Jewish people fighting against the Roman occupiers. Unfortunately, both times ended in tragedy for the Jewish people, and hundreds of thousands of Jews were brought as slaves to the Roman Empire, where they started speaking Latin, but it was mixed with Aramaic and Hebrew. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, a lot of these Jews migrated north into the Rhine Valley between present-day France and Germany, and they started speaking this mixture of Old French, Middle High German, but still with some Latin, Aramaic, and Hebrew words mixed in. And then in around the 11th century, Jews started migrating eastward into the Kingdom of Poland, which at that time was expanding. And that's how Jews ended up in present day Lithuania and Ukraine and Belarus, before the Russian Empire took over those areas. And so Yiddish started to take on Slavic words and Slavic grammatical structures as well. And that's the Yiddish that we know today. So much of the vocabulary is in fact based on Middle High German, as is modern German, but it is a separate language. It has its own grammatical structure and its own literature and millions of speakers.
Oh, now we want to show a little clip from, actually, I think it's the first of your 15-minute lessons in Yiddish. What is Yiddish? And we'll meet some of these characters later in the slideshow that you've created. Very interesting way to save money, Muddle. Instead of hiring actors to portray themselves as your students, you are the actor for 6 different, I don't want to call them stereotypes, 6 different individuals, Yiddish, Jewish individuals. I think one of them is not
all
Jewish.
Jewish.
The professor is not Jewish, right?
And Wayne isn't Jewish. 2 of them are not.
Wayne is not Jewish either. But 6 individuals who have come to your lessons with their own backstories and their own histories in life, and you created a wonderful, wonderful classroom that way. So, do we have the clip of Muttel? And what is Yiddish anyway? To start off his lesson.
No, what is Yiddish anyway? Yiddish, it's a funny language. You got schmutz and schmendrick and schmegegi. Oh, of course we talked Jewish in my home growing up.
Yiddish. Yeah, I heard of that. That's
When I was growing up in Flatbush, Brooklyn, Yiddish was the language that my parents spoke when they didn't want the children to understand. Oh, ciao, Marcello, darling. There's Schwitz and Kishkis and oh, Meshuggah, that's a good one. That always gets a laugh. Oh, man. Yiddish, isn't that what Bubby and Zadie used to speak back in the olden times, like in Russia or whatever? Hey, Ma! Get me some kale chips and a mocha frappuccino! Why, Yiddish is a glorious language of prose and poetry. Here, let me read you an example. This is an epic poem by Yud Lamed Kalushiner, written in 147 stanzas. First stanza. Es laufen Räder in Geeil und drehen sich auf Walzen und mästen schon von der Zeit, wo Scharen sich zu sehen, wie ausgemosten wären und antläufen von Geschrei, wo Stepperei von blanken Nodeln auf Maschinen tanzen. Second stanza. Und noch der Läufen ist. We'll check back on him later.
Oh yeah, it's the composite language made up of Middle High German with some French, Latin, Slavic, Aramaic, and Hebrew, right?
I wore this hat for you today because I knew you were coming, and this hat was once worn by the great Yiddish theater star Jenny Goldstein in one of her shows. Oh, well, of course, I remember all of her songs. Could I sing one? No, it would be too emotional. It would make me cry. All right, maybe just one. Oh, Yiddish, Mama, es geht nicht besser auf der Welt. I'm sorry. See, I told you I would get very emotional. Oh, you got all the funny curses too in Yiddish, like you should grow like the onions with your head in the ground. Now that's Yiddish.
And that's great. That was terrific. And of course, Muddle, you played every single one of the characters, including the teacher. So great.
It was
When
a pandemic necessity. I'll tell you the story of how it got created. So, of course, by the second week of March 2020, everything was shutting down because COVID cases were starting to show up in the U.S. And they originally said it would be 2 to 4 weeks. We're going to work from home. And I remember the day that we were shutting our office down, one of my coworkers, her name is Gia Pace, who was running our social media, said, you know, people are really kind of scared right now and are going to get very, you know, anxious being at home and lonely. So why don't we do programs online to keep people engaged? So it took us only a few days. So after the shutdown started, I think on day 4, we already started having online programs. We did what we called living room concerts, where people were performers within our sphere were performing concerts literally from their homes that we were doing, like on Facebook Live. And so we did that for a few weeks. Every day we had something, and people were starting to ask for a Yiddish lesson online. And I taught Yiddish, what we call schmooze classes online, conversation classes, not very heavily academic. You don't need to read or write. But the numbers of people who were watching these programs was far more than we could have in a practical class. You could have maybe 20, 30 people in a class. But we were talking about hundreds of people who were tuning in to watch these. And so I said, okay, I'll do a little 15-minute program, but I don't want it to be a lecture. I don't want just me standing up there explaining Yiddish grammar and vocabulary. So I thought, well, whenever I teach a class, the most interesting part and the fun part of the class are the students. Their interruptions and their telling of their own stories and they're arguing with each other. That's what really makes the class worthwhile. And, you know, to address the question you brought up about, you know, why we didn't have actors playing these roles, we're an Actors Equity company. We're a union house, and Actors Equity hadn't really worked out a way for their actors to be on contract for online programs. They were sort of, no, they hadn't figured things out. They were kind of arguing a bit with the Screen Actors Guild about who had jurisdiction over these things, if it was a theater company. So because they couldn't figure out how to hire union actors, I just decided I'll play all the parts myself. So I rated my children. I have 2 children ages at the time 9 and 11, and I rated their costume collection and borrowed a few things from my wife and pulled some things from my own closet, and I created these characters out of the things that I had available. And the first episode was so well received that we just kept going. I've just finished season 3, so there's 45 episodes out there. We've been viewed about 115,000 times, so a lot of people are watching these programs, and they're part of this phenomenon during COVID of people learning Yiddish. Duolingo came out with a Yiddish program. Online Yiddish content is coming from every corner. The Yiddish Forward has a daily program, a word of the day that they put out. There's Yiddish classes online from the Workers' Circle, from YIVO, from all sorts of organizations, and it's just this amazing growth. And the folks we've put together about, I think by now, close to 120 online programs, many of which you can watch on our website, nytf.org. Look for the on demand. It's like watching Netflix. We've got hundreds of programs. You can just watch them on demand anytime. Concerts and theatrical productions, all sorts of things. Some of them that we've done have been amazing. Unfortunately, they're not all available in the archive, because one of the ways that we figured out that we could work with our union actors is through a special agreement, which only allows us to show certain programs for a 4-day window. So we've done amazing concerts with hundreds of participants and play readings and all sorts of things. And unfortunately, they're only there for 4 days and then they go away. But we've been able to reach audiences from all over the world. I think at this point we've had close to 500,000 views of our various programs.
Okay, that's terrific, and we're going to turn to some slides now, so you can talk more about Yiddish and of course the Volksbühne. So, Muddle, is that you?
That's me.
Okay. Let's see. This is the National Yiddish Theater Volksbühne. That's the logo for this. Tell us about this theater that you work for.
Right. So we've been around since 1915, so we're 107 years old. The Volksbühne started out as a sort of a community theater, a branch of the Workers' Circle. People who worked in sweatshops during the day, immigrants who wanted to participate in theater, and they did literary plays that had social messages. So the very first production in 1915 was a Yiddish translation of Ibsen's An Enemy of the People. And then after that, they did plays in translation from other world writers like Gogol, and by around 1920, the serious Yiddish literary theater movement was underway, and the Volksbühne began premiering original plays written in Yiddish. The professional theater along Second Avenue was mostly known for lighter fare, musicals, soap, melodramas, comedies, vaudeville, things like that. And the Volksbühne was a place where more serious work was being presented. As time went on, and assimilation and the population shift from the Lower East Side out to the outer boroughs and eventually to the suburbs, the commercial Yiddish theaters were becoming fewer and fewer. Mostly we're talking about the period after World War II. There just weren't as many Yiddish speakers around, and they didn't live in the neighborhood anymore. So the Volksbühne remained because it was a nonprofit. It was a part of the Workers' Circle, so it didn't rely on making a profit in order to stay around. And it became a sort of a haven as the commercial theaters were closing. The Volksbühne remained going strong. The professional actors who were losing their jobs began to work at the Volksbühne. So in the 1960s, it transitioned into something called semi-professional. So most of the company were still volunteers, but the lead roles and the directors would be hired professionals. And then in the later stages, in the 1980s and 90s, when the commercial Yiddish theaters were all gone, the company professionalized even more, and it came under a contract with the Hebrew Actors Union, which is America's very first actors union. It's older than Actors Equity Association. And that was the case until 1998. In 1998, there was a generational shift in the management. Zalman Mlotek and Eleanor Risa took over the management of the company, and the company then formed a contract with Actors Equity Association. It became a fully professional company, and things really took off from there. So they started doing things like having English translation super titles so that non-Yiddish speakers could understand the show. It's like watching a foreign language film for them. And the quality of the shows became equal to anything that one would see off Broadway. And by 2004, we started getting recognized by the theater community in New York First with a show called On Second Avenue, which is a musical review about the history of the Yiddish theater, and that got a Drama Desk Award nomination. For those who don't know the Drama Desk, it's sort of like the Golden Globes of the theater. So the Tonys are for Broadway shows only. And then there's something called the Lucille Lortel Awards, which are for off-Broadway shows. But the Drama Desks are for both Broadway and off-Broadway. So when we started getting nominations for our shows, we were in competition with the big Broadway shows. So we got several shows that got nominated over the years: On Second Avenue, the Yiddish Pirates of Penzance, Five-ish Finkel Live, The Golden Land, The Golden Bride, and then in 2018, when we produced the Yiddish Fiddler on the Roof, we not only got nominated, but we won. We beat the big Broadway shows who got nominated for Outstanding Revival of a Musical that year. So our company has just grown enormously, especially over the last 20 years.
Yeah, that's terrific. And even with the pandemic, people are rushing to see the Fiddler on the Roof. I saw it twice, and it was terrific. Now I got this model. Do you see this from
Yes.
Yiddish is Magic? It will outwit history. This was not a bookmark. This is a pad, my mouse pad that I got from the Yiddish Book Center. I tried to buy another one to give you as a gift and to give my Yiddish teacher, my Yiddish teacher, Naomi Miller, but they don't have them anymore. I'd love to get them. But
never, as we say, how unfortunate.
And are you familiar with this quote?
Yes, in fact, I am. Max Weinreich was one of those teachers who pioneered teaching Yiddish at universities at Columbia. And Outwitting History became the title of Aaron Lansky's book about how he built the Yiddish Book Center. For those who don't know what the Yiddish Book Center is, they started in the 80s, I believe, collecting Yiddish books that people just weren't reading. So either from libraries that were going to throw them out, or personal collections, maybe older family members had Yiddish books that their children couldn't read, and rather than throwing them out, he encouraged them to give them to him as a safe repository. And they've now collected millions and millions of books. They have a beautiful center on the campus of Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts, and they got a grant from Steven Spielberg to digitize the books. So they've made them available. There's over, I believe, 11,000 Yiddish books available for free online from their website, including quite a number of Yiddish plays. And it's one of the resources that we go to when we're looking for new material to present. Right.
Okay. It's a great center. And my mother, Olive Shalom, as they say, was a sponsor of the Yiddish Book Center when it first got started years ago. And Aaron Lansky lived in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is my husband and his whole family's hometown. So there's a lot of interesting connections there. It's a wonderful place.
Indeed.
I did this because I wanted you to talk about, as you started to, the history of Yiddish, how it got formed over the centuries by Jews traveling, being exiled from one country to another, and then mixing in with the various languages. So I wrote this up, and I want you to explain it.
Sure. I give this is the sentence that is my example of how Yiddish is a layer cake of languages, that one sentence can contain words that have origins in many other languages. So this sentence, Serce, avada benchich licht jeden Shabbos, means, darling, of course I bless the candles every Sabbath, every Shabbos. And let's break it down word by word. Serce is a Russian word. It literally means heart, but it's used to mean darling, and that's worked its way into Yiddish as a term of affection. Avada means of course, and that is an Aramaic word. Benchen is actually rooted in the Latin word benedictus, to sanctify or to bless. Ich and Licht and Jeden, those are words of German origin. And Shabbos, of course, is a Hebrew word. Shabbat means seven, or the seventh day. So here you've got one sentence, and it's not even a long sentence, and it's got words from Russian, Aramaic, Latin, German, and Hebrew.
That's great. What a great explanation, and a great history to make that. How many Yiddish speakers are there in the world today, Matel? Do you know?
I don't know the figure, but it is growing rapidly, not only because of people who, like myself, who have learned it as secondary languages, but primarily because it's still the primary language of the home in the Hasidic community, and the Hasidic community tends to have very large families. It's not at all unusual for a Hasidic family to have 8, 9, or even 10 children, or some cases more. So there's this very, very fast growth of Yiddish. I believe I could be completely wrong in this, but I seem to recall seeing the number of around a million Yiddish speakers in the world, but I can't verify that offhand.
Okay, so now on this slide, IL Peretz, Yud Lamed Peretz, I want to know that I went to the Yud Lamed Peretz Workman Circle schools through the elementary and then into the high school in Washington Irving High School in Manhattan. So talk a little bit about who IL Peretz was and the importance of his literature to our culture.
So Yud Lamed, or I.L. Peretz, is known as the father of modern Yiddish literature. He was a very prolific poet and story writer. He did some writing for the theater as well. But more important almost than his own writing is the fact that he pulled up so many other writers. He organized salons and helped make connections between writers and publishers in interwar in Warsaw. Warsaw was really the center of the Jewish literary movement in that period between, especially between World War I and World War II, but really started before then. A quarter of the population of Warsaw was Jewish. This was the biggest Jewish metropolis in all of Europe. And there was a lot of connectivity back and forth between the United States and what was going on in Poland. So writers who were writing in Europe were being published in New York in serialized in the newspapers, the daily newspapers of there was Der Vorwärts, there was Der Tag, there was Der Morgenjournal, Freiheit. There were several Yiddish newspapers that were very important because they didn't just deliver the news. They published poetry and song lyrics and serialized stories and short stories. So it was really this enormous cultural outpouring, and Peretz was really at the center of it all.
Okay, now these are some of the post-its from some of the productions that you've had at the theater.
Yes, this one is Gimple Tom. That was 2008. That was a musical adaptation based on the very famous short story by Isaac Bashevis Singer, famously translated by Saul Bellows. And yeah, that was an absolutely wonderful production. It was one of the most memorable in my experience. This one is very recent. This one is from 2019 in December. It was the last show that we did before COVID times. It's called Die Kishofmacherin, or The Sorceress. It is the first piece of Yiddish theater ever performed in America. It is one of the earliest works of Yiddish theater, period. So it was written in the 1870s by Avram Goldfaden, who's considered the father of the modern Yiddish theater, and it was brought to America in 1888. So only about 10 years after it was written, by a young 14-year-old immigrant named Boris Tomaszewski, who would, of course, go on to be a great Yiddish theater impresario, and the grandfather of Michael Tilson Thomas, the classical conductor. And so this work, the story is a fascinating story. I'll tell the quick version of it. So the 14-year-old immigrant from Ukraine was working in a sweatshop, in a cigarette factory. He had a little bit of musical training. He had sung with his Temple's chorus, and but he had never seen Yiddish theater, certainly had never participated in it. But his co-workers in the factory would sing these songs that they remembered from the old country from having seen this show. And he just fell in love with it and decided, I'm going to make this happen here in New York. So he convinced a beer hall owner from the Bowery to financially stake the production, to rent a theater on East 4th Street. For those who know New York, it's where La Mama is presently located. And they brought a core company of actors from London who were performing this particular show. And then they were going to fill it out with locals, including himself. But this is very early in the time of Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe. The German Jewish community, however, had been pretty well established in America for about 50 years already, and they were really pushing for assimilation. They did not want Yiddish culture to take root in America. The German Jews had long since stopped speaking Yiddish, and in America they figured that learning to speak English and act like Americans was the way to go for the safety of the Jewish community. So they tried to kill the production. They paid off the leading actress to fake a sore throat and not go on. But the 14-year-old Boris Tomaszewski, there's a couple versions of the legend. One of them says he told the orchestra, start playing the overture. I'm going to go up to her apartment and get her to come down. So he offered her to match the money that the German Jews were paying her. One version of it said no dice. She wasn't going to go on. So he put on the dress and he went on as the lead actress. 14-year-old boy. The other version of the story says that she did agree to go on, but by the time they got down to the theater, the orchestra had been playing the overture over and over again for like an hour, and the audience just got tired of it and went home. So either way, it's not the greatest start to Yiddish theater, but they tried it again a few weeks later. It was a success, and Yiddish theater took off. The story itself is sort of a combination. So it's a fairy tale halfway between Snow White and Cinderella. So there's a young girl whose mother has passed. There's a wicked stepmother who plots with a local witch or sorceress to have her father thrown in jail on trumped up charges. And the girl they're trying to get hold of the family fortune. So the girl is sold as a slave to Ottoman Turks. Her fiance, who you see in this picture dancing with her, sets off around the world to rescue her. He finds her singing in a coffee house in Istanbul, and along with the comic relief of the show, an itinerant peddler named Hotzmach, they rescue her and bring her home. But the witch and the wicked stepmother have one more trick up their sleeves. The family is reunited at a tavern, and they poison their drink so that everybody passes out, and then they sneak up and set the roof on fire. But a very helpful young man, the brother of the tavern owner, wanders home. He sees in the middle of the night some careless person has left the ladder outside, so he takes the ladder away. Of course, that means that they're now trapped on the roof that they've set fire to. Our heroes are awoken and rescued, and the bad guys get their just desserts, and the good guys are rescued, and we end with a wedding. That's the scene where these are the Turkish sailors who are transporting our young heroine Mirala to her fate. And there's the sorceress herself mixing up her potion along with her assistants. So this is from one of our online shows that we did last year called the Hava Tequila Cabaret. One of the amazing things that happened during COVID times is that our artists really developed amazing talents to create video productions. So a lot of the singers were creating their own music videos. So this was a collection of, I believe, 7 music videos that we presented last year. And you'll notice the grogger because we presented it during Purim week last year. And I'm happy to announce that we will have a follow-up this Purim week coming up. We will have another presentation of Hava Tequila Cabaret. Okay, these are our characters from 15-Minute Yiddish. And that's your Yiddish teacher who made the shidduch between us. That was Naomi Miller, who's an actress and singer who's worked with me before. Yiddish Renaissance, that was one of these huge online productions that we did last July. It was in honor of our artistic director Zalman Mlotek's 70th birthday. It featured over 150 performers from all around the world. We did 18 musical numbers that included stars of the klezmer and the theater world. We had special greetings from Itzhak Perlman and Mandy Patinkin, and we had the alumni of the Hazamir Youth Chorus singing a song, Yiddish songs of the Chalutzim, of the pioneers who settled in at that time was British Mandate Palestine, but in the founders of what would eventually become the State of Israel. Quarantine Schmarentin, this was one of the first shows that we did. Back in, I believe this was April of 2020. We had one of the first projects that I took on when I started working at the Yiddish Theater was to form a group called the Folksbiene Troupe. These were young performers who, like myself, were learning Yiddish as a secondary language, and we were doing shows of humor sketches and theater songs, and we were touring all over touring all over the United States, bringing Yiddish theater performances. And so during quarantine, when it first started, one of the first shows we did was several selections, some monologues and sketches from that show with the troupe.
Don't you have all these cataloged and people can watch them?
Yes.
Just by going to the website of the National Yiddish Theater Folksbiene?
Yes, nytf.org.
Right. Oh, I wanted to go back. So Fiddler on the Roof, that was a huge success, as you were talking about. And I just wanted to talk to you about how the translations are made into the Yiddish. Of course, it was a show about Jewish people during times of trouble in Russia when they had to immigrate to America and to other lands. How is the process of translating? How does that work?
Well, this show was actually already translated in 1965, only 1 year after the original Broadway production. The story goes that shortly after it was premiering on Broadway, there was an Israeli production in Hebrew, and many of the actors had been born in Europe. This was 1964-65, and they spoke Yiddish, and they knew all of the original Sholem Aleichem stories that Fiddler had been based on. So they started putting in interjections of original quotes from Sholem Aleichem in Yiddish, and the audience really responded to it because the majority of the audience spoke or at least understood Yiddish at that time. So one of the company members, an actor named Shraga Friedman, who had been born in Warsaw but moved to the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, in 1939 before the war, he took to translate the entire production into Yiddish. So they did run for only about 2 or 3 weeks from what I understand, but it was well received, and they made a cast album, and the cast album made its way all the way around the world. The Yiddish production was done in Bucharest, Romania. I'm not sure if it was his translation or not, in Warsaw, Poland, and in Montreal, Canada, but there was never a Yiddish production in America because you just couldn't get the rights to it, especially in New York. There had never been a professional production that wasn't a Broadway revival. They never even entertained having an off-Broadway production, let alone one that wasn't in English. So we happened to hit upon a moment in time in 2018 when the last Broadway English revival had just closed down in under a year, and nobody else had yet grabbed the option. What happens in the Broadway world is producers will option shows which grant them the exclusive right to produce it on Broadway. They may or may not exercise that option. In other words, they're sitting on the rights, and if they choose to do a production, they can do so. But in the meantime, certainly nobody else can do one while somebody else is holding that option. So nobody else had grabbed the option for another Broadway production because the previous Broadway one had just closed less than a year earlier. So we were able to get the rights to it. It was the first time ever that this show was produced in Yiddish in America. We got Joel Grey to direct, the legendary Broadway actor and the son of Mickey Katz, the great klezmer musician and Yiddish English satirist. And we got the top drawer team of designers, including Beowulf Barrett, who won the Tony Award for his set design for Come From Away, and Dan Moses Schreier as our sound director, also Tony Award winning. It was just the right cast. We got the great Stephen Sky Bell, who had been in the Broadway cast of Fiddler playing Laser Wolf in that production a year before, as well as Stephanie Lynn Mason. She played our Huddle. She was the cover for the daughters in the Broadway production. And Jackie Hoffman, the great comedian, as our Yenta, and the rest of the cast. Just everything clicked, and they formed a mishpocha, a family, and the chemistry was there. And the show that we had originally booked for 6 weeks with the option of expanding to 8 weeks ended up running for 6 months at our home downtown at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. It got picked up for a commercial run for a year at Stage 42, which is the biggest off-Broadway house, 499 seats. On 42nd Street. If it had one more seat, if it were a 500-seat house, it would have been a Broadway house, but this is how they keep it to an off-Broadway contract. It was set when it closed in January of 2020. It was supposed to tour for 3 weeks to China, of all places, in the spring of 2020. That obviously didn't happen. There was supposed to be a tour in the fall of 2020, and there was supposed to be another production of Fiddler in Yiddish, a different company, but the same production in Australia. It was supposed to run in Sydney and in Melbourne, all of which, of course, got canceled because of the pandemic. But we are hoping very much that that we will be able to resume plans after the pandemic is behind us. We can't hear you. I think you're muted. Sheila, we can't hear you. I'm sorry, can you repeat that? We couldn't hear you, Sheila.
Oh, I said that there's an amazing universality to this show, and I read that in Japan it is a sensation. So there's so much to connect with from the show. It's not about its universality is very much there.
Absolutely, yes. People understand the concept of times changing and how that affects the family, outward pressures. Of course, we understand the what violence and turning civilians into refugees. We've seen this many times throughout history. And even if you're not Jewish, and this is not specifically your family's history, so many Americans have come from, their families historically have come from other places, not because they necessarily wanted to leave, but because they had to. The Irish, the Italians, Asian refugees from World War II and from Vietnam. We understand what what that is.
Right. And just tell us the translation. Shadchan, matchmaker, matchmaker. Is that the?
Absolutely right. A
Yeah.
shadchan is a matchmaker. In this case, it's a female matchmaker. So we add the feminized ending, and it becomes shadchan te.
Okay, great. Ah, here you are with what I've become very familiar with you. I'm taking a crash course in your 15-minute Yiddish. You have about 15 episodes the last 3 years, right? And tell us about how you got started with that.
Right. There was just demand. People wanted to learn Yiddish online, and I couldn't teach a class, so I decided to make a show about it. And there was just so much demand to keep it going that I've now completed 45 episodes over 3 seasons. Right. That's
Right.
Professor Thomas Shlomo Thompson. He teaches in the Judaic Studies Department at the University of Alaska, Utqiagvik.
So what's interesting is Muddle, that you've created all of these 6 characters to help you in the lessons, in the classes. You've given them each backgrounds, uh, religions, ways of life, histories. It's terrific. And they help you. So your talents are fantastic. Not only are you a great Yiddish teacher, but you're a great actor too in performing all of these roles. And you, how did you decide who to pick? So let's go from the professor. He's a professor now.
Right.
Who's
So
here?
he
He is
serves.
again. Very pensive expression. That's
Yes,
the professor
he
again.
serves a very
And
important.
who's she?
Oh, this is Sophia Frankel. She's very fancy. She grew up in Flatbush, Brooklyn, going to the yeshiva of Flatbush School, but now she's a jet setter. So so in this season, I believe she was in Italy. There she is sipping an espresso. In the next season, she was in the South Pacific. In the most recent season, she was in a chalet in Switzerland. She is a professional, famous person. Nobody's really sure what she's famous for, but she is professional at it.
All right. And what was the Yiddish word? Barimta? Was that the Yiddish
Oh,
word for
Barente, right?
famous?
Barente is famous, well known.
Right. Okay, that's great. Ah, who is
This
this
is
guy who's
Scott.
constantly with the TV on?
Yes, this is Scott. Scott William Noodleman Krumholtz from Brooklyn Heights. He is the youngest member of our class. In season 1, he was in 8th grade in middle school. Now he's in high school. He in the first season he was always kind of distracted playing, as you see, playing video games in the background. He still always has the TV on, but now he's watching old Yiddish movies and Yiddish concerts and things like that. He's become one of the more serious students in the class.
Okay. Oh, and who is this guy?
This is Wayne, just Wayne. He doesn't use a last name, so like Cher or Madonna. He just hangs out in the park. He's from Kew Gardens, Queens. He was just sitting on a bench, minding his own business when Nosy Me interviewing people, do you know what Yiddish is? And he just decided he didn't have anything better to do, so he now takes the class.
Oh, and who is she?
Oh, this is a fan favorite. This is Helen, who also goes by her Yiddish name Hinde Lefkowitz. She's a retired air traffic controller who lives in Monroe Township, New Jersey, which is a town where Naomi actually is in one of these retirement, over 55 communities. Where they have like a little Yiddish club, and she's just one of the most enthusiastic students who's always happy to share her experiences and sing songs that she knows.
Right. And this guy, Oy Nebuch, what does that mean? Oy Nebuch.
Oy Nebuch means like, oh yeah, how unfortunate, too bad. This is Murray Schwartz, who is our resident jokester. He is a Borscht Belt comic, so he often tells jokes as part of his routine. But he also grew up in the Bronx in a very traditional religious household. He went to a Talmud Torah for, to study after school, and so he has a lot of religious knowledge as well as cultural knowledge.
Right. There he is.
After
and
telling
you yeah. One of your favorite segments is if you have time at the end of your 15-minute, maybe a little more than 15-minute lesson, you get Murray to tell a Yiddish joke at the end, right?
Absolutely, yes.
And the last photo, I just want to give a shout out to Naomi Miller, who is my Yiddish teacher, helping me write my memoirs, so to speak, in Yiddish, which I do in English. And there she is with you. So you want to give her a shout out, Muddle?
Absolutely, Naomi. Mwah, much love. Thank you for making the introduction to Sheila. This is a picture from. This was very early in my career with the Yiddish theater when I was smooth-faced and several pounds lighter, and we had done a reading of a Sholem Aleichem play called "The Jackpot," Dos Große Gewinns, and Naomi was one of the actors in that production.
Okay, great. I hope we did you justice, Naomi. Okay, so now we're going to go back to our studio and talk a little bit more about what's on your plate now. We have a show that's starting, the Garden of the. Tell us about it. It's a wonderful
Garden
show.
of the Finzi Continis. It is a brand new commissioned opera. If you are familiar with the novel by Giorgio Bassani or the film, the 1970 film that won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, then you probably already know the story. It's based on the real story of a Jewish family that were aristocrats in Ferrara, Italy. They actually had a title and everything and were very wealthy, of course. And they were rather insulated during the years of the war, especially, well, Mussolini was around. No terrible harm had come to the family. But of course, historically, what happened was the Mussolini fascist government collapsed and the Germans came in as occupiers, and they didn't really care about the family's wealth or title. They were simply Jews as far as they were concerned, and they were treated like any other Jews, and the family really wasn't prepared for this. This is an amazing new opera that was composed by, this is like a dream team. The composer, Ricky Ian Gordon, and the lyricist Michael Corey, both of whom had shows or have shows running at Lincoln Center at the same time. So Michael Corey wrote the lyrics for Flying Over Sunset, which I believe just closed, and Ricky Ian Gordon composed the music for Intimate Apparel, which is just opening. So we're very fortunate to have this debut. It is being presented together with the New York City Opera, and it's running only 8 performances, some of which are already sold out. It's running tomorrow is actually the first performance, so January 26th through February 6th. So you don't have a lot of time to see it, but you can get tickets from our website, nytf.org. And then we go into rehearsal for Harmony, which is a new musical by Barry Manilow and Bruce Sussman, who is his writing partner. It is the story of the Comedian Harmonists. The Comedian Harmonists were a real-life singing group that were popular in Germany in the period between World War I and World War II. They were like the Beatles of their day. They made dozens and dozens of recordings. They made, I believe, about 10 or so films. They toured the world, sold out huge grand houses like Carnegie Hall. And of course, when the fascist government began to rise in Germany, they were first censored and then they were outright banned. All of the reason why very few people have heard of them these days is that their records and their films were actually physically destroyed by the Nazis. And so the Jewish members of the company were able to flee Nazi Germany before they would have been arrested, and they all survived the war. But sadly, after the war, even though they all survived, they never got back together again. That is going to be running from the preview start March 23rd, and then it will run from April 14th through May 8th. And we have high hopes for that one to have a Broadway run after it debuts at our theater at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. Again, tickets will be available or are available already at nytf.org. And for those who are interested in helping to support our work, there is going to be a special gala preview performance on April 12th, which will be honoring Barry Manilow, and there will be a dinner at the museum before the performance.
Oh, great. I love Barry Manilow. My daughters and I, he appeals to every generation, from infants to centurions at 100-year-olds. He's terrific. So tell me, you are going to still do the 50-minute lessons? So you're going to have a fourth season?
That's a question mark right now. It's very demanding of my time. It takes about 4 months of work to create one season. It is a one-man operation. I write the scripts, I create the graphics, I play all the parts, and then I do all the editing as well. So it's very labor intensive. And now that we're opening back up for live performances, the question is how, what demands there will be on my time. But
did you tell me? I'm sorry, we're crossing each other. Did you tell me though that you may be doing a textbook based on your shows?
Yes, I'm working on creating a companion book so that people who want to go back and learn Yiddish by watching the show will also have the material available, so that it's not just seeing the words while they're up on the screen, but that they can reference and practice with.
And anybody can just go to nytf.org and go to Folks Being Alive section, and you can watch every single one of the 3 seasons of your lessons, right?
Yes, they're on YouTube as well. If you go to YouTube and look for 15-minute Yiddish,
and
you can
meet those terrific characters, all of whom you portray, a cross section of Jewish life and non-Jewish life in America. So tell me, as a final thought from you, what would you most want to say to an audience who says, "Oh, Yiddish is back? What's it all about?" What would you most want to say to that?
Come and find out for yourself, because everybody who comes to see it loves it. People who thought that they couldn't understand it or access it see that with the translations that we put on the set above the stage, it's very easy to follow along, and you'll be surprised how much you kind of instinctively understand anyway. It really is for everybody, Jewish, not Jewish. If you're looking for an authentic experience and an authentic look into the Jewish world, this is the place to find it. If you are Jewish and you're looking to reconnect to your roots and to learn more about where your family came from, and why we are who we are, this is where we tell those stories, where you can find all of that out.
Okay, and we're back, and you're back, and that's a wonderful thing. So thank you so much, Muddle. It's been great having you as a guest and learning about your coming of age into Yiddish culture and how you're furthering it now in all of your fantastic work and your art. Thank you so much, and we'll
Thank
see
you
you
for
all
having me.
next time on Talkback. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.